Neighbor calls cops on black family's BBQ, but when the father stepped out, everyone's jaw dropped. Moving truck rumbled down Maple Street, its engine a low growl that seemed to echo the anxiety in Marcus Johnson's chest. 45, Marcus was starting a new chapter in his life, one that filled him with equal parts excitement and trepidation. As the truck pulled up to the stately two-story colonial, 1542 Maple Street, Marcus took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Well, this is it," he said, turning to his wife, Alicia, who sat in the passenger seat of their SUV. "Our new home." Alicia reached over and squeezed his hand, her warm brown eyes filled with pride and love. "You've earned this, Marcus. We all have." In the back seat, their two children, 15-year-old Zoe and 10-year-old Tyler, were too engrossed in their smartphones to pay much attention to their new surroundings. Marcus chuckled to himself. Some things never changed, no matter where you lived. As the family climbed out of the car, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment wash over him. This house, in this prestigious neighborhood, was a tangible symbol of how far he'd come. From a kid growing up in one of Atlanta's toughest neighborhoods, to the newly appointed chief of police in the affluent suburb of Oakwood, it had been a long, challenging journey. The sound of a door slamming next door caught Marcus's attention. An older white woman, probably in her late 60s, had emerged from the house to their right. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching the moving truck with a mixture of curiosity and something else Marcus couldn't quite place. Wariness, perhaps. Always one to make a good first impression, Marcus raised a hand in greeting. "Good morning," he called out cheerfully. "I'm Marcus Johnson, your new neighbor." The woman's expression didn't change. She gave a curt nod but said nothing, her eyes now fixed on Alicia and the kids as they began unloading boxes from the SUV. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He'd encountered this sort of reception before, of course. As a black man in America, and especially as a black man in law enforcement, he was no stranger to prejudice, but he'd hoped things might be different here. Alicia must have sensed his discomfort, because she was suddenly at his side, her hand on his arm. "Why don't you go introduce yourself properly?" she suggested softly. "Kill her with kindness, remember?" Marcus nodded, squaring his shoulders once again. It was a phrase they'd coined years ago, their strategy for dealing with the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, racism they encountered. With a reassuring smile to Alicia, he made his way across the lawn to the neighbor's house. "Hi there," he said, his voice warm and friendly as he approached the porch. "I'm Marcus Johnson. My family and I just moved in next door. I wanted to come over and introduce myself properly." The woman regarded him silently for a moment, pale blue eyes scrutinizing him from head to toe. Finally she spoke, her voice clipped and cool. "Eleanor Whitaker, welcome to the neighborhood." Marcus waited for more, but it seemed that was all Eleanor was willing to offer. Undeterred, pressed on. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Whitaker. We're really looking forward to getting to know everyone in the neighborhood. If there's anything we can do to be good neighbors, please don't hesitate to let us know." Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Well," he said, her tone slightly less frosty, "I do hope you'll keep the noise down. The last family that lived in that house had all sorts of people coming and going at all hours. It was very disruptive." Marcus nodded, choosing to ignore the implied assumption that his family might be similarly disruptive. "You don't need to worry about that, Mrs. Whitaker. We're pretty quiet folks. I work in law enforcement, so I'm all about keeping the peace." The mention of law enforcement, Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly. "Oh? Are you a police officer?" "Actually, I'm the new chief of police," Marcus said, unable to keep a note of pride from his voice. "Just transferred here from Atlanta." This information seemed to give Eleanor pause. She studied Marcus with renewed interest, as if seeing him for the first time. I see," she said, her voice uncertain. "Well, that's quite impressive." Marcus could almost see the gears turning in Eleanor's head, preconceptions clashing with this new information. He'd seen it many times before, people struggling to reconcile their biases with the reality of who he was and what he'd achieved. "Thank you," Marcus said, deciding to press his advantage. "I'm looking forward to serving this community. Oakwood seems like a wonderful place to live, raise a family." Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, it is. We take pride in our neighborhood here. As you should, Marcus agreed. Well, I should get back to unpacking. It was nice meeting you, Mrs. Whitaker. I hope we'll have the chance to chat again soon. As Marcus turned to leave, Eleanor called out, Chief Johnson? He turned back, eyebrows raised in question. Welcome to Oakwood, she said, and this time there was a hint of warmth in her voice. As Marcus made his way back to his new home, he felt a small sense of victory. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He'd faced down bigger challenges than Eleanor Whitaker in his time, and he'd always come out on top. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and trying to make their new house feel like home. By early evening, exhausted but satisfied, Johnson family decided it was time for a break. How about a barbecue? Marcus suggested, wiping sweat from his brow. Christening the new grill and all that? The idea was met with enthusiastic agreement from Alicia and the kids. Soon, the aroma of grilling chicken and vegetables filled the air, mingling with the sounds of laughter and music drifting from the portable speaker Tyler had set up on the patio. As Marcus tended the grill, he couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. This was what he'd worked so hard for all these years. A beautiful home, a loving family, a prestigious job. He was determined not to let anything, or anyone, spoil it. But even as he basked in the warmth of the moment, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with Eleanor Whitaker was just the beginning. The road ahead might be bumpier than he'd anticipated. Little did he know just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be, or how soon his resolve would be put to the test. As the sun began to set on their first day in Oakwood, casting long shadows across their new backyard, the Johnsons were blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing. A storm that would challenge not just their place in the neighborhood, but the very fabric of the community itself. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity for the Johnson family. Marcus spent long hours at the police station, familiarizing himself with his new team and the unique challenges of policing in Oakwood. Alicia busied herself with getting the kids enrolled in their new schools, and putting the finishing touches on their home. Zoe and Tyler, for their part, alternated between excitement about their new surroundings and bouts of homesickness for their friends back in Atlanta. It was on Saturday afternoon, exactly 1 week after their move, the incident occurred. The day had dawned bright and clear, perfect late summer day. Marcus, finally free from the demands of his new job, had decided it was time for another family barbecue. This time, he'd invited a few of his new colleagues from the police force, hoping to build stronger connections outside of work. As the afternoon wore on, the Johnsons' backyard came alive, the sounds of laughter, music, and friendly conversation. The aroma of grilling meat and vegetables filled the air, mingling with the sweet scent of Alicia's famous peach cobbler baking in the oven. Marcus stood at the grill, expertly flipping burgers while chatting with Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of his most promising officers. Alicia was inside, putting the finishing touches on a batch of her homemade lemonade. Zoe and Tyler had invited a couple of kids from the neighborhood, much to their parents' delight, and the sound of their splashing and laughter drifted from the small above-ground pool they'd set up. It was, by all accounts, perfect summer afternoon. Until it wasn't. The shrill sound of a siren cut through the air, causing conversations to halt mid-sentence and heads to turn in confusion. Marcus felt his cop instincts kick in immediately, his body tensing as he scanned the area for any sign of trouble. The siren grew louder, and suddenly a patrol car came to a screeching halt in front of the Johnsons' house, its lights flashing. 2 officers Marcus didn't recognize stepped out, their hands resting cautiously on their holsters. "What in the world?" Marcus muttered, setting down his spatula and moving towards the front yard. Lieutenant Chen was right behind him, her face a mask of confusion and concern. As they rounded the corner of the house, they saw the 2 officers approaching the front door. One of them, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, was speaking into his radio. "Dispatch, we're on scene. Multiple subjects in the backyard." Proceeding with caution, Marcus felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Were they talking about his family barbecue? "Excuse me, officers," called out, his voice firm and authoritative. I'm Chief Marcus Johnson. What seems to be the problem here? Two officers turned, startled by his approach. The younger one's hand twitched towards his gun, a movement that didn't go unnoticed by Marcus. He felt Lieutenant Chen tense beside him. "Sir, please stay where you are," the older officer said, voice gruff. "We've received a complaint about a disturbance at this address. Loud music, possible underage drinking, suspicious individuals gathering." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. A disturbance? Suspicious individuals? He was about to respond when movement caught his eye. Eleanor Whitaker was standing on her porch, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and unease on her face. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Eleanor had called the cops on them. On a family barbecue. Taking a deep breath to calm his rising anger, Marcus spoke again. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. This is my home. The gathering in the backyard is a small party for my family and some of my colleagues from the police force. I can assure you, there's no disturbance or any illegal activity happening here." The younger officer looked uncertain, his eyes darting between Marcus and his partner. "Sir, we still need to check things out. Protocol, you understand." Before Marcus could respond, Lieutenant Chen stepped forward. "Officers, I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen from Oakwood PD. I can vouch for Chief Johnson. This is indeed his home, and I'm one of the guests at this gathering. There's no need for further investigation." The older officer's brow furrowed. "Chief Johnson?" the call said. He trailed off, realization dawning on his face. Marcus nodded grimly. "The call said what, officer? That there were suspicious individuals at this address? Would those suspicious individuals happen to be black?" A heavy silence fell over the scene. The younger officer had the grace to look embarrassed, while his partner's face was a mask of discomfort. "I think," Marcus said, his voice low and controlled, "that we should all go back to the station and have a talk about proper protocol and the dangers of acting on biased complaints without proper verification." Just then, Alicia emerged from the house, pitcher of lemonade in her hands. She froze at the sight before her. Her husband and Lieutenant Chen facing off against two uniformed officers with Eleanor Whitaker watching from next door. "Marcus?" she called out, her voice tinged with worry. "What's going on?" Marcus turned to his wife, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring. "It's all right, honey. Just a misunderstanding. These officers were just leaving." He turned back to the two officers, his gaze steely. "Isn't that right, gentlemen?" The older officer nodded, clearly eager to extract himself from the situation. "Yes, sir. We apologize for the disturbance. We'll be on our way." As the officers retreated to their patrol car, Marcus's gaze locked with Eleanor's. The older woman had the decency to look ashamed, quickly disappearing back into her house. Once the patrol car had driven away, Marcus turned to Lieutenant Chen. "Sarah, I'm sorry you had to witness that. Please go back and enjoy the party. We'll be there in a moment." As Sarah made her way back to the backyard, Alicia approached Marcus, setting the lemonade pitcher down on a nearby table. "It was her, wasn't it?" she asked softly, nodding towards Eleanor's house. "She called the police on us." Marcus nodded, anger he'd been suppressing finally bubbling to the surface. "Can you believe it? A family barbecue in our own backyard, and she calls it in as a disturbance." Alicia placed a comforting hand on his arm. "What are you going to do?" Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know yet, but I can't let this slide. Not just for us, but for every other family that might move into this neighborhood. This kind of behavior can't be tolerated." As they stood there, the sounds of the party in the backyard drifting around them, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He'd taken this job hoping to make a difference, to bridge the gap between law enforcement and communities of color. He never imagined he'd be facing that challenge in his own backyard, literally and figuratively. "We'll handle this together," Alicia said, giving his arm a squeeze. "Like we always do." Marcus nodded, drawing strength from his wife's unwavering support. "You're right, but first, let's go salvage what's left of our barbecue. I've got some explaining to do to our guests." As they made their way back to the party, Marcus's mind was already working, formulating a plan. This incident, as upsetting as it was, could be an opportunity. An opportunity to open a dialogue, to challenge preconceptions, and to make real, lasting change in Oakwood. Little did he know that this was just the beginning. The event set in motion by Eleanor Whitaker's misguided call would ripple out far beyond their quiet suburban street, challenging not just the Johnson family, but the entire community of Oakwood to confront their biases and redefine what it meant to be a good neighbor and a good citizen. As Marcus rejoined his guests, plastering on a smile and trying to restore the jovial atmosphere, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something much bigger than a simple neighborhood dispute. The real test of his leadership, his principles, and his ability to effect change was just beginning. The sun had long since set by the time the last of the guests left the Johnson home. As Marcus closed the front door behind Lieutenant Chen, he let out a long, weary sigh. The rest of the barbecue had passed without incident, but there had been an undercurrent of tension that no amount of good food or friendly conversation could fully dispel. Alicia appeared at his side, slipping her arm around his waist. "You okay?" she asked softly. Marcus nodded, pulling her close. "Yeah, I'm all right. Just processing everything." They made their way to the living room, where Zoe and Tyler were slouched on the couch, their faces illuminated by the glow of their smartphone. "Ids," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "Can you put those down for a minute? We need to talk." Zoe and Tyler exchanged a glance before setting their phones aside. They could sense the seriousness in their father's tone. As the family settled into their seats, Marcus took a deep breath. "I want to talk about what happened earlier today." Again, "I know you both saw the police officers arrive, and I'm sure you've picked up on some of what was going on." Tyler, his young face scrunched in confusion, spoke up first. "Dad, why did those cops come? We weren't doing anything wrong." Marcus felt a pang in his chest at the innocence of his son's question. "No, buddy, we weren't doing anything wrong, but sometimes people make assumptions based on what they see or what they think they see." Zoe, ever perceptive, narrowed her eyes. "It was because we're black, wasn't it? That lady next door, she called the cops on us because we're black." Alicia reached out, taking her daughter's hand. "We don't know for sure that it was Mrs. Whitaker who called, honey. But it probably was," Marcus added, deciding that honesty was the best approach. "And yes, Zoe, it's likely that race played a part in why the call was made." A heavy silence fell over the room. Tyler, his eyes wide, asked in a small voice, "But Dad, you're the police chief. How can they call the police on you?" Marcus leaned forward, looking his son in the eye. "Tyler, being the police chief doesn't make me immune to prejudice. In fact, it sometimes makes things more complicated. Some people have a hard time accepting that a black man can be in a position of authority." "So what are we going to do?" Zoe asked, a hint of defiance in her voice. "We can't just let her get away with this." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His daughter's fighting spirit never failed to impress him. "You're right. We can't just ignore this, but we also can't respond with anger or retaliation. That would only make things worse." "Then what?" Tyler pressed. Marcus exchanged a glance with Alicia before continuing. "We're going to use this as an opportunity to educate and create change, not just for Mrs. Whitaker, but for the whole neighborhood, maybe even the whole town." He outlined his plan to organize a community meeting to address not just this incident, but the broader issues of racial bias and community policing. As he spoke, he could see the mix of emotions playing across his children's faces: fear, anger, but also pride and determination. "It won't be easy," Marcus concluded. "We might face more resistance, more misunderstandings. But if we approach this with patience, understanding, and strength, we can make a real difference." As the family discussion wound down, Marcus couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. Despite the challenges they faced, his children were showing resilience and maturity beyond their years. The next morning, Marcus rose early, his mind already racing with plans for the day ahead. He had a series of difficult conversations ahead of him, starting with a visit to his neighbor. Steeling himself, Marcus walked next door and rang Eleanor Whitaker's doorbell. After a long moment, the door creaked open, revealing a wary-looking Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus began, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I think we need to have a conversation about yesterday's events." Eleanor's eyes darted nervously, but she nodded, stepping back to allow Marcus inside. As they settled in her living room, Marcus took in the details of her home. The antique furniture, the walls lined with family photos. This was a woman with deep roots in the community, someone who had likely seen a lot of changes over the years. "Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus began, "I want to understand why you felt it necessary to call the police yesterday. Was there something specific that concerned you?" Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. I heard loud music, and there were a lot of people coming and going. I didn't know what was happening." Marcus nodded slowly. "And did you consider coming over to talk to us directly? To see what was going on?" A flash of shame crossed Eleanor's face. "I suppose I didn't think of that." "Mrs. Whitaker," Marcus continued gently, "I have to ask, did the fact that we're a black family influence your decision to call the police rather than speak to us directly?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I'm not. I don't consider myself a racist," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "I believe you don't want to be racist, Mrs. Whitaker, but sometimes our actions are influenced by biases we might not even be aware of. What happened yesterday could have had serious consequences, not just for my family, but for the officers involved and for the community as a whole." Eleanor nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "I'm so sorry. I never meant to. I didn't think." "I know," Marcus said, "and that's why I'm here. Not to condemn you, but to invite you to be part of the solution. I'm organizing a community meeting to discuss issues of racial bias and community policing. I'd like you to attend." Eleanor looked up, surprise evident on her face. You want me there? After what I did?" Marcus nodded. "Especially because of what happened. Your perspective, your willingness to learn and change, it could be incredibly valuable." As Marcus left Eleanor's house a short while later, he felt a glimmer of hope. The conversation had been difficult, but he sensed a genuine desire for change in his neighbor. His next stop was the police station. As he walked through the doors, Marcus could feel the eyes of his officers on him. News of yesterday's incident had clearly spread. In his office, he found the two officers who had responded to the call. Officer Jason Miller, the younger of the two, and Sergeant Tom Brooks, 20-year veteran of the force. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his tone serious, "we need to discuss your response to yesterday's call." What followed was a frank and at times uncomfortable conversation about racial profiling, the importance of proper verification of complaints, and the potential consequences of biased policing. "I understand you were responding to a call," Marcus said, "but your approach, your immediate assumption of wrongdoing, that's exactly the kind of policing we need to move away from." Officer Miller, looking thoroughly chastened, spoke up. "Chief, I'm sorry, I never meant to, I didn't think." Marcus held up a hand. "I know, Miller, and that's the problem. We need to start thinking. Really thinking about our actions, our assumptions, and the impact they have on the community we're supposed to serve." By the end of the conversation, both officers seemed to have a new understanding of the situation. Marcus assigned them both to assist in organizing the community meeting, seeing it as an opportunity for them to engage with the community in a positive way. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself juggling his regular duties as police chief with the preparations for the community meeting. He reached out to community leaders, arranged for guest speakers, and worked on his own presentation. That evening, as he sat at the dining room table surrounded by notes and plans, Alicia brought him a cup of coffee. "How's it going?" she asked, massaging his tense shoulders. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. "It's a start," he said, "but we've got a long way to go." Alicia bent down, kissing the top of his head. "One step at a time, honey. You're doing good work." As Marcus looked over his notes, he couldn't help but feel a mix of determination and apprehension. Community meeting was just the beginning. The real challenge would be translating words into action, changing not just policies, but hearts and minds. Little did he know that the events set in motion by that fateful barbecue were about to catalyze changes far beyond what he had imagined. The coming weeks would test not just his leadership skills, but his commitment to justice and his ability to bridge divides that had existed for generations. As he finally headed to bed that night, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. But Along with that weight came a sense of purpose. He had been given an opportunity to make real, lasting change, and he was determined to make the most of it. The day of the community meeting arrived, bringing with it a palpable tension that seemed to hang over Oakwood like a heavy fog. As Marcus adjusted his tie in the mirror, he could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a pivotal moment that could shape the future of the community he had sworn to serve and protect. "You've got this," Alicia said, appearing behind him in the mirror. She reached up to straighten his collar, her touch a comforting anchor in the storm of his thoughts. Marcus nodded, drawing strength from his wife's unwavering support. "I hope so," he replied. "There's so much riding on this." As the Johnson family made their way to the Oakwood Community Center, Marcus couldn't help but notice the looks they were receiving from passersby. Some were curious, others wary, and a few were openly hostile. It was a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. The community center was packed by the time they arrived. Marcus scanned the crowd, noting the diverse mix of faces. He saw Eleanor Whitaker seated near the front, looking nervous but determined. Officer Miller and Sergeant Brooks were there too, along with most of the Oakwood police force. Community leaders, local business owners, and residents from all walks of life filled the seats. As Marcus made his way to the podium, a hush fell over the room. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of all the preparation he had done for this moment. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We're here to discuss some important issues that affect not just our community, but communities across our nation." Over the next hour, Marcus led a frank and at times uncomfortable discussion about racial bias, community policing, and the importance of open dialogue. He shared personal experiences both from his time as a police officer and as a Black man in America. He invited others to share their stories too, creating a space for honest, if sometimes difficult, conversations. "What happened at my family's barbecue last week," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "was not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, one that we need to address head-on if we want to build a truly inclusive and just community." As he spoke, Marcus could see the impact his words were having. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But everyone was listening. When it came time for questions, hands shot up across the room. Marcus called on a middle-aged white man in the third row. "Chief Johnson," the man began, his tone combative, "with all due respect, aren't you making a mountain out of a molehill? It was one misunderstanding. Why drag the whole community into it?" Marcus took a moment before responding, reminding himself to remain calm and professional. "Sir, I understand why you might see it that way. But this misunderstanding, as you call it, could have had serious consequences. What if the responding officers had been more aggressive? What if there had been a confrontation? These are the kinds of misunderstandings that can escalate into tragedy." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Moreover, this isn't about one incident. It's about addressing the underlying biases that led to that incident, biases that affect how we interact with each other every day." The next question came from a young Black woman near the back. "Chief Johnson, how can we trust that anything will really change? We've heard promises before, but nothing ever seems to get better." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the pain and frustration in her voice. "That's a fair question, and I don't have an easy answer. What I can tell you is this. Change starts with conversations like the one we're having tonight. It continues with concrete actions, changes in police training and procedures, community outreach programs, and a commitment to transparency and accountability." He went on to outline some of the specific changes he was implementing in the police department, including enhanced bias training, community engagement initiatives, and a citizen review board to oversee police conduct. As the meeting continued, Marcus was heartened to see people from different backgrounds engaging in dialogue, sometimes heated, always respectful. Even those who had initially seemed resistant were beginning to listen and consider new perspectives. Towards the end of the meeting, Eleanor Whitaker raised her hand. Marcus felt a flutter of anxiety as he called on her, unsure of what she might say. Eleanor stood, her voice shaky but determined. I want to apologize," she began. to Chief Johnson and his family, and to the whole community. My actions that day, they were wrong. I let my fears and biases cloud my judgment, and I'm truly sorry for that. A murmur ran through the crowd as Eleanor continued. I'm an old woman, set in my ways, but this experience has shown me that it's never too late to learn, to change. I want to do better, to be a better neighbor and a better citizen. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. This was more than he had hoped for. Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker, said, his voice thick with emotion. Your willingness to acknowledge your mistake and commit to change, that's exactly what we need more of in this community. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus felt a cautious sense of optimism. There was still a long way to go, but tonight had been a start. People were talking, listening, beginning to understand each other's perspectives. After the last attendee had left, Marcus found himself alone in the community center, lost in thought. He was startled by a hand on his shoulder. You did good, Chief, Lieutenant Chen said, a smile on her face. Really good. Marcus nodded, grateful for the support. Thanks, Sarah, but this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. As they walked out into the cool night air, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it head-on. The support of his family, his colleagues, and a community that was beginning to open its eyes to the need for change, he felt ready to take on whatever came next. Little did he know that the ripples from tonight's meeting would soon grow into waves, bringing both unexpected allies and fierce opposition. The true test of Oakwood's commitment to change was yet to come, and Marcus Johnson would find himself at the center of a storm that would shake the community to its very foundation. As he drove home with his family, the streetlights casting long shadows on the road, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. A story not just about one family or one community, but about the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in America. The coming days and weeks would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and moments that would test everything Marcus believed in. But for now, as he glanced at his family in the car with him, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. They had taken the first step on a long journey, and whatever came next, they would face it together. In the weeks following the community meeting, Oakwood found itself in a state of flux. Conversations started that night had spilled out into everyday life, sparking debates in coffee shops, at school board meetings, and around dinner tables across town. For Marcus Johnson, it was both exhilarating and exhausting. Every day brought new challenges. Some days it was a heated argument at a town council meeting about the allocation of police resources. Other days, it was a sensitive situation that required all of Marcus's diplomacy and experience to navigate. But there were bright spots too, moments that gave Marcus hope that real change was possible. One such moment came about a month after the community meeting. Marcus was leaving the police station late one evening when he spotted a familiar figure waiting by his car. It was Eleanor Whitaker. Mrs. Whitaker, Marcus said, surprised. Is everything all right? Eleanor nodded, a determined look on her face. Yes, Chief Johnson. I wanted to talk to you about something important. As they stood in the dim light of the parking lot, Eleanor explained that she had been doing a lot of thinking since the community meeting. She had started attending diversity workshops at the local library and had even joined a book club focused on racial justice issues. I realize now how much I didn't know, how much I never even thought to question, she said, her voice quavering slightly. And I want to do more. I want to help make real changes in our community. Marcus felt a surge of emotion. This was exactly the kind of transformation he had hoped for, hadn't dared to expect. That's wonderful, Mrs. Whitaker. What did you have in mind? Eleanor squared her shoulders. I want to start a neighborhood watch program, but not the kind that calls the police on every unfamiliar face. I want to create a program that brings neighbors together, builds understanding and trust. Over the next hour, Marcus and Eleanor sat in his office, brainstorming ideas for this new initiative. By the time Eleanor left, they had the beginnings of a plan that could truly make a difference in Oakwood. As word of Eleanor's initiative spread, it sparked a wave of community engagement. Other residents, inspired by her example, began coming forward with their own ideas for promoting unity and understanding in Oakwood. But not everyone was on board with these changes. About 2 months after the barbecue incident, Marcus faced his biggest challenge yet. It started with a series of anonymous complaints filed against the police department, alleging that the new diversity initiatives were a waste of resources and that Marcus was neglecting real police work in favor of political correctness. Then came the protests. A group of residents, led by a vocal minority who opposed the changes Marcus was implementing, gathered outside the police station demanding his resignation. As Marcus watched the protesters from his office window, he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had known there would be resistance, but seeing it manifest so openly was still disheartening. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Lieutenant Chen. "Chief," she said, her face grim, "you need to see this." She handed him a tablet open to a local news website. The headline made his heart sink. Controversial police chief faces calls for resignation amid claims of mismanagement. As Marcus scanned the article, he felt a mix of anger and disappointment. The piece was filled with quotes from anonymous sources within the department, criticizing his leadership and suggesting that his focus on community relations was compromising public safety. For a moment, Marcus felt overwhelmed. Was it all falling apart? Had he pushed too hard, too fast? But then he remembered why he had taken this job in the first place. Thought of his family, Eleanor Whitaker's transformation, of the young people in Oakwood who deserved a fair and just community to grow up in. With renewed determination, Marcus stood up. "Sarah," he said to Lieutenant Chen, "call a press conference. It's time we address these issues head on." The next day, Marcus stood before a sea of cameras and microphones, his family and a diverse group of community supporters standing behind him. "I've heard the concerns raised by some members of our community," he began, his voice steady and resolute, "and I want to address them directly. Changes we're implementing in the Oakwood Police Department are not about politics. They're about justice. They're about creating a safer, more equitable community. Everyone." He went on to present data showing that community engagement initiatives had actually led to a decrease in crime rates and an increase in solved cases. He highlighted stories of improved police-community relations and the positive impact it was having on public safety. "Change is never easy," Marcus continued, his voice rising with passion. "But it is necessary. We cannot continue to ignore the biases and inequities that have plagued our justice system for too long. I took this job because I believed that Oakwood could be a model for what community policing should look like in the 21st century. I still believe that, and I'm asking all of you to believe it too." As Marcus finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. Even some of the reporters, usually stoic, were nodding in approval. In the days that followed, Marcus was heartened to see a shift in public opinion. Letters of support began pouring in, not just from Oakwood residents, but from people all over the country who had heard about what was happening in this small suburban town. The anonymous complaints within the department were investigated and found to be largely baseless. Those officers who had been resistant to change began to see the positive results of the new initiatives and slowly came around. 6 months after the barbecue incident that had started it all, Oakwood had transformed. The police department had become a model of community engagement and fair policing. Crime rates were down, and public trust in law enforcement was at an all-time high. One sunny Saturday afternoon, almost to the day of that fateful barbecue, the Johnsons decided to have another cookout. This time, they invited the whole neighborhood. As Marcus stood at the grill, he looked out over his backyard, filled with neighbors of all races and backgrounds, chatting, laughing, and enjoying each other's company. He saw Eleanor Whitaker deep in conversation with Zoe about her plans for college. Officer Miller was playing catch with Tyler and some other neighborhood kids. Alicia came up beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. "You did it," she said softly. Marcus shook his head, smiling. "No," he replied, "we did it. All of us." As the afternoon wore on, Marcus found himself in conversation with a young black couple who had just moved to Oakwood. "We were nervous about moving to the suburbs," the woman admitted, "but we've heard so much about what's happening here in Oakwood. about the changes you've made. It made us feel like this could be a place where we could belong." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. This was why he had become a police officer in the first place. This was why he had taken on the challenges of the past 6 months. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Marcus realized that what had started as a crisis had become an opportunity to create real, lasting change, to build a community where everyone felt safe, valued, and heard. There was still work to be done, of course. Change was an ongoing process, not a destination. But looking out at the diverse group of people in his backyard, Marcus felt a sense of hope and possibility that he hadn't felt in a long time. The incident that had threatened to tear Oakwood apart had instead brought it together, creating a model for what a truly inclusive community could look like. And as Marcus Johnson, police chief and proud resident of Oakwood, stood surrounded by his family and neighbors, he knew that the best was yet to come.